the gospel has been misunderstood probably more than anything throughout church history, going all the way back to Paul's day. Paul, that's what Galatians is all about. The book of Galatians is all about addressing the law versus grace, works righteousness versus free righteousness in Christ, or receiving Christ by faith, His grace by faith. And so, throughout church history, you've seen two extremes. One of the extremes is, as I just pointed out, works righteousness, which is do everything you can to save yourself, or you will not be saved. That's works righteousness. Or what's been dubbed by the reformers antinomianism. Antinomianism, or free grace, or cheap grace, as we call it today, is now that you've been saved by Christ, you've been saved by His grace, it doesn't matter how you live, because it's not dependent on what you do or what you don't do if you're saved. You also see elements of that in Calvinism. You see elements of that in the once saved, always saved doctrine. I don't subscribe to either one of those. I'm not a 5-point Calvinist, although I did agree with Calvin on a lot. So you see a lot of those same elements. That's live. And I'm not saying Calvinists and people who subscribe to once saved, always saved will tell you. I'm not trying to mischaracterize anybody here. That you can live however you want, and that's okay. I'm not saying they're saying that. But if you take the logic of the once saved, always saved, if you take the logic of antinomianism, that's where you end up. If it's not by anything you do or you don't do, then who's to say you can't live however you want, because it's not what you do or don't do. I think as a Christian, you find the truth somewhere in between those two extremes. Aristotle once kind of expounded this same concept. Of course, he was talking of virtue, but Aristotle's virtue was to become that virtue, not just to live according to the virtue. Like, you were to become that thing you were trying to obey. That's what real virtue was, according to Aristotle. It was to change your character and shape you of who you are. Of course, we know that nothing you can do or will not do can change you on the molecular level or the spiritual level that the gospel can only do. It's only by the gospel that you can truly be transformed into your spirit. Everything else is behavioral modification. But Aristotle talked about the golden mean. There's two extremes, and somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, you find virtue. Well, it's kind of like that with the gospel. There's two extremes, works righteousness or cheap grace, and then in the middle of that is the gospel. The gospel, I think, is best characterized and given to us through Ephesians chapter 2, 8 through 10. That's Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and it's not of yourselves. It's the gift of God, not as a result of works, lest anyone should boast. For you are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works." Again, that was Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 10. What that tells us, Ephesians chapter 2, 8 through 9 tells us that, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. It's not of yourself." That clearly defines our salvation is not of our works. Nothing we can do or will do or have done will stop God from saving us if we will place our trust and faith in Him. That's the biblical understanding, the biblical model of the gospel. But then 10 goes on to tell us where the works come in. You can't separate verses 8 and 9, and a lot of people do. They quote Ephesians 2, 8, 9. They always leave off 10, and I cringe when they do it, because they're leaving off the other half of the gospel, which is works. But not works to save yourself, works because you're saved. So the 10th verse says, okay, you've been saved now. "For you are God's workmanship." What's the workmanship? The workmanship is the grace that God has worked in your heart and in your soul and your inner man. Changed you. You are God's workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. Once you are God's workmanship, you're in Christ Jesus, now your life is to consist of works. good works. Paul says in another place, I think it's Galatians 5:13, somewhere around that address, he talks about not using your freedom in Christ as an occasion for the flesh, but to use it to serve one another in love. And I think that's the best works we're going to do as Christians. We're saved. We've been set free by Christ because of the gospel of grace. And now because of our thankfulness for what Christ has done for us, how He's transformed us and changed us, and He's given us new desires to want to serve Him and to love Him and to love others, now we do that. We serve one another in love. Serve the church first. That's the biblical order. Serve our brothers and sisters in Christ, but also serve everyone outside of the church to the best of our ability. Some people don't want it, so you can't force it upon them, but to serve people and to help them and bless them with the love in your heart. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. To be transformed by the grace, not because you've earned it. And yes, there's allowance for failures and faults, but we shouldn't use those as excuses to remain in those faults. If Christ really won the victory on the cross and His Spirit dwells in us, shouldn't that same victorious, overcoming Spirit dwell in us? Yes. We should be able to humble ourselves when we need to humble ourselves and admit when we're wrong, but we should also have the same kind of grace to help us defeat and overcome sin. So, I hope that was a help to somebody. I've spent many, many, many years meditating on the idea of the gospel, and that's where I've ended up. I'm sure I'll spend many, 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 many more years, if Lord willing, trying to figure out the finer nuances and correct my understanding of the gospel. So, God bless you.